for people listening for the first time, Jiu-Jitsu exploded in 1993 when Royce Gracie won the first UFC. It really blew up there. But that's like where mainstream America came out into the picture. And so, just from the recollections, I would love to get Drysdale. We got to get that guy on.
Yeah.
Just from the recollections from the book, and I could be totally wrong because there's no facts, right? It's just people's opinions and news clips and newspapers at the time.
Like his understanding of what happened.
Yeah, of all the other accounts. So from all the other people, what it sounded like was that Jigoro Kano, who is the founder of judo, came from a jiu-jitsu style called Kitoryu Jujutsu, which was mainly standing techniques to fend off multiple attackers. Because back in those days, in the samurai and the bandits and all that, it was starting to get very rare. People would be honorable, fight one-on-one.
Yeah.
So you got to fight off multiple people. And what do? You're not going to go ground if you're, fighting multiple. You just boom, grab, throw, trip, sweep, run away. And so was it Kitaryu or Kitoryu? But anyway, one of those, the names. And this was during the Meiji era, right after the samurai got abolished. So what was really interesting from just what I read, I'd love to be clarified or corrected. Leave your comments if I'm wrong. What was really cool is right after that Meiji era, this is after the war, the samurai versus the Imperial Army, and the Imperial Army won.
What year was this?
Gosh, this must have been the mid 1800s. I think it was 1868,
so
but I can't be sure.
1,200 years ago ish.
No, just
200 years ago.
Just 150.
Oh dang, dude, my math sucks.
So this is like my great grandparents' age, which is nuts.
Oh dang, that is not long ago.
That's not long.
I'm in my head. I'm picturing like thousands of years ago,
Yeah.
But it's only a few hundred.
Right.
Sorry, I jumped straight
to...
Was that 2,000 years ago?
Yeah.
It's 150 years ago.
Yeah, 150. So about 4 generations.
Gotcha. Your great-greats.
Yeah. Great-greats. But what was really cool is during that era, it was evolving. No longer you needed warrior class, no longer samurai. It was evolving from what I read from the book, from Western influences, which was evolving Japan. And so Jigoro Kano, he also realized this is a quote that was in the book that was sourced. So I'm gonna butcher it, but he said that he found jiu-jitsu really fascinating because it allowed a weak person to defeat a bigger and stronger opponent.
Wait, Okano?
Jigoro Kano said that because
where did he find jiu-jitsu?
So he found that in Japan. So jiu-jitsu, samurai jiu-jitsu, has been around since a recorded paper history, 1300 AD. Because it was the art of the samurai to kill people.
Yeah.
And jiu-jitsu literally just translates into gentle techniques. But it was used to kill. And there's all sorts of variation. There's lots of schools. From the book, there was hundreds of jiu-jitsu schools, apparently, back in the day, with different samurai schools teaching a certain way. I'm sure that certain schools taught it with, you take them down, you slash their neck. I mean, some crazy. I mean, this is back in the day.
Yeah. Anything goes.
Anything goes. And so that was really cool. And then recorded history was 1300, but spoken, it was like way before that too. I mean, all part of the world have some sort of grappling, whether it's like Greco-Romans or way back in the day. So Jigoro Kano came from this Kitaryu and this other style. He had 2 styles of jiu-jitsu, 2 jiu-jitsu masters. And during that Meiji era, jiu-jitsu had a bad connotation because it had the connotation of prize fighting and drawing spectacles of, look, watch me, I'm going to beat this guy up using these techniques, using jiu-jitsu. And so Jigoro Kano wanted to kind of separate from that because he wanted the everyday person to learn the importance of martial arts and culture, because he could see that the essence of the warrior, this is from the book, he could see, I forget whose account this was, that he could see the warrior spirit dying off
Mm-hmm.
of like discipline, honor, and the way of the samurai, bushido. And so he really wanted to kind of make it into more of an educational program where you could, of course, learn judo, some techniques, but then also learn the discipline part of, you know, being disciplined, cultured, standing in line, bowing, showing up on time, just creating better humans from what I was reading.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was really cool because this was probably early 19 or late 1800s. So just about 100 years ago. And the really interesting thing about this whole thing was he repackaged it as judo because he wanted it to be the way. The word do just means way. So instead of the jujutsu techniques, techniques, he wanted to call it the way of gentle. And it worked because he would fight, and then of course there was a big clash because the old school jujutsu schools were like, hey, what are you doing repackaging our jujutsu into this new thing called judo? What is that? And so the stories that were in the book were almost like they were battling. They would send like Jigoro Kano would send some of his best guys from judo to fight some of the guys in jujutsu, and it was really interesting because there's multiple stories in the book. Man, this is why I got to get Drysdale on this. That jujutsu was winning a lot of the fights because they were doing it for a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
And then eventually when it came to like this major fight scene in front of the emperor to decide which art was going to be propagated, spread in Japan, Jigoro Kano brought old school jujutsu techniques, ashigarami, footlocks. And I was like, wait, what? Jigoro Kano judo, they brought back footlocks.
In judo.
To beat these jujutsu guys.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that crazy?
History repeats itself.
History repeats itself. So that's just from one recollection. So I'm not 100% sure if that's what went down. But one of the stories in the book was talking about that. That Jigoro Kano would use ashigarami, leg techniques, to beat the jujutsu guy. Yeah. And so from there, judo became the martial art for Japan. And jiu-jitsu started dying off. And what was really interesting, it wasn't that jiu-jitsu was dying off. It was just more so the thought process of jiu-jitsu, which is the reason why when Mitsuyo Maeda was training under Kano, I think this was in the 1920s, that the judo techniques were all jiu-jitsu techniques. It was just packaged in a way that it was more of an education in terms of like self-defense, because throwing someone is much more practical at that time than how do we get them to the ground and just start from the ground. And so plus he had the Kitaryu Jujutsu style, which is mainly tachiwaza, standing techniques. But anyway, Maeda, and he was like the third or fourth guy to leave Japan to spread judo. So one story says Kano didn't want to spread judo outside of Japan. Another story said that Kano wanted to spread judo outside of Japan. So it's like, believe what we want. But the thing was, Kano sent a handful of students outside the country. So those are facts, right? So whether it's one way or the other way, the fact was there was a handful of Japanese judokas that would go to America, Europe, all these places. Now, Mitsuya Maeda, he would eventually go to all over the world, make his way to Brazil. And in Brazil, from the stories and recollections of the people interviewed, they were talking about was this judo or jiu-jitsu? And Maeda used them interchangeably because to him, and at that time, it seems like it was the same thing, because the same standing throw in judo is the same standing throw in jujitsu, in Japanese jujitsu. The same sankakujime, triangle choke, is the same triangle choke. I mean, all the techniques are the same.
Yeah.
It's just how it's taught and how the influence is. And Maeda, and if you think about jiu-jitsu now, I'm kind of skipping now. If you think about jiu-jitsu now, the Brazilian influence really did take over, because you don't see, like, even to this day in judo, the recollections is really cool, because they're talking about how in Japan, in judo, everybody bows. Boom. When I did judo in high school, same thing. You're bowing. Boom. Everybody gets up at the same exact time. You bow at the same time. And then some Brazilians still have that, right, where you're bowing, or you stand in line by rank. So there's still that Japanese influence. But the majority of jiu-jitsu people now, they have more of a Brazilian influence. Show up, after warm up, skip the warm ups, just I'm just gonna roll. I'm just gonna roll today. I don't need technique, just jump in and roll. Versus in Japan, that'd be unheard of.
It's almost like a surfer learn a martial art. Yeah,
the surfer culture that merged with that was there in Brazil, merged with jiu-jitsu. And so I'd probably say like majority is that way, the more like free culture of like, hey, it doesn't matter what rank you are, it doesn't matter what school you go, let's just all train. And then a minority still is old school traditional, which is like you're gonna stand in line by rank, and basically, we're all gonna bow to the sensei, we're gonna bow to grandmaster, and that's cool too, because that's the tradition part, which is still alive in judo. So that's something that's pretty cool. Whether that's good or bad is up to person listening. But it's just really cool how that book really opened my mind about like, some stories say that Maeda never met Carlos Gracie.
Oh dang.
Yeah, some stories say they did. Some stories said there was a few months, and other people are just saying, they've never met. Who they've met was Maeda's student, which is still cool, right? Maeda's student.
Wait, who they met was Maeda's student?
Yeah.
And not Maeda himself?
Not Maeda himself. So I was like, because there's no proof. It was just one person's word. And other people at that age were like, no, he's never met him. It was his father, Gastal Gracie, that met. But then also there's like myth and legend, that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's lost in translation.
And so people really don't know. And when people were asking in the book, who promoted Carlos Gracie to black belt? They said himself. Because, there was nobody
to promote him.
To promote. And it's just such a interesting book. I loved it. I was just like, oh man, like this is...
What's the name of it again?
I think it was called Open Guard, Closed Guard.
Open Guard, Closed Guard.
I think, yeah. And like... modern day jiu-jitsu, like the triangle chokes and all that, came from judo and the classical jiu-jitsu, because there's books from 1300 AD, drawings, 1300s, of people doing arm locks and kimuras and triangle chokes and foot locks, 1300 AD in Japan. And so, and even closed guard, open guard. So that was the thing in the book where I think it was in the book, Elio was saying he invented jiu-jitsu, or he invented the guard.
Mm-hmm.
But the guard was there from 1300 in drawing.
But even maybe he he invented it.
He definitely altered it a lot though. Like, in terms of like usage and of course.
Yeah.
What was really interesting was when... and I love the family. I'm thankful for the family, because the guy who promoted me is a Hickson Gracie black belt. So like the Gracie family, I'm really thankful. But what's interesting is that the whole notion that judo was made for the tough, strong people, because that was the pitch though. That was the marketing pitch. You think about it. The marketing pitch, which there were great business and marketers, were that, Jujutsu, but there's, I can't even say that because there's so much in that the 3 hours that I read about the World War II happening, which completely changed everything. The fact that Japan became an Olympic sport in the 60s changed everything.
Judo became an Olympic sport.
Olympic sport, yeah. That's when judo evolved so much into the sport it is now. Because when Jigoro Kano was still teaching it, which is why Maeda and these guys who went to Brazil and America would do submissions, was because in judo there was called tachiwaza and newaza. Tachiwaza was all standing technique, standing throws, sweeps, all that. Newaza were the sweeps, bottom sweeps, arm bars, submissions, chokeholds, leg locks. They were all there. And slowly by slowly, Kano and judo started removing the dangerous techniques because people would get hurt. So he would just eliminate it, which made sense to get rid of foot locks at the time.
Yeah, I know, dude. If you had an ACL tear in those times, you're just like never doing jiu-jitsu
never
again.
Healing, because there was no. I mean, what are you gonna do? You tear your knee or Achilles. Yeah.
Especially in those times, there wasn't even ice.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Go get some ice.
100 years ago.
Probably didn't even know to put ice on it.
Yeah. People are like, what do? I can't walk.
Yeah.
I can't work. And back then.
And then I'm done. Now I die.
Yeah. I mean, back then, you imagine like most jobs, you're probably physical labor.
Yeah.
And if
you're worthless if you can't move.
You can't do anything. You can't be a farmer. You can't. I mean, there's so much things you can't do back in those days. And so it made sense. And that's why I understand. Which is interesting because there's some criticism of like, oh, the judo. But for the time being, when there's context into what the country evolution was, it's like, oh, that's what he was doing. That makes sense. And it's so crazy because towards the end of the book, he was saying I forget who it was, but that jujitsu came full circle. Originally, jujitsu was used for the samurai to kill. Mm-hmm. Then it became.
Oh, it's for the people now.
Then it became jujitsu for prize fighting, professional fights. Jigoro Kano would say, if you want to be a professional fighter, get out of here. Yeah. And so he totally was against professional fighting for money, fighting for a spectacle too. He was against it. This is why I believe that after reading the book and all these accounts, that Maeda would refer to it as judo and jujitsu. Because he didn't want to tarnish the judo name, so he would call it by the original name. These are jujitsu techniques, and then judo is more like a way of system. But it's crazy how it came full circle. Now look, jujitsu.
Everyone's doing it.
Yeah, everyone's doing it. Prize fighting. There's professional jujitsu athletes.
Yep.
Professional MMA fighters.
Using
gotta know jujitsu, and it's just so crazy. It went full circle.
That is insane. Over the span of what, 200 years?
120 years.
120?
Yeah, that's not that long.
That's crazy too with the internet and everyone's all linked together. Yeah. The techniques just my feed is just guys all over the world doing all these techniques that I've, maybe some I've seen, some I haven't, and then just sharpening everyone else's techniques.
Yeah. And it's crazy because at the same time, oh my God, I completely forgot about Cosen Judo. So Cosen Judo, the judo I was talking about is called Kodokan. That's Jigoro Kano's judo, Kodokan. That's the one where it's very sports, where it's just throw and done. Cosen Judo is basically 80% ground, 20% stand up.
From who made that?
So that was the question in the book, and nobody knows exactly who. But it was at a university in Japan that were like, hey, the suspicion is because Japanese people typically aren't brash. They're gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna become, they're not usually like that, and so they're not exactly sure who initially did that. But the university in Japan came to the consensus of like, hey, we cannot forget about the ground techniques. We're doing too much standing emphasis. 80% standing, 20% ground.
Because it's once you get them on the ground and then they stand back up.
Yeah.
Then what? You throw them again?
Right. And when he made it with the intention, it made sense because he said that if you're fighting multiple attackers as a martial art and then you have two people coming at you, you got to quickly throw and disengage, throw, disengage. And, I understand that. which is why he put the rule of like, if you're on the ground for more than 30 seconds, a second person can kick you or punch you in the head, which makes sense.
Yeah,
so it's not optimal. So that I understand, but it's just when it evolved too much, and it's so crazy. It came full circle. But going back to Cosen Judo, it became a thing for a couple reasons from what I read. Was that number one, it's easier for people learning judo for the first time to practice newaza, ground techniques, if you're already 18. So let's just say you go to university, you go to college, and if you heard about judo at 18, to be slammed around hundreds of times a day can be a little shocking and rough. Versus, you maybe do 20%, so you do like 10 throws left and right, and the rest is all ground fighting. Kind of like jujitsu almost, right? They said that that's much easier to teach and retain people if you're learning judo at 18.
Just flying bodies across the room for an hour.
Yes. Versus like if you started judo when you're like 5 or 6 and your body's soft and nimble, you know how to land, and you've been thrown hundreds of times, by the time you're 18, no factor.
Yeah.
But if you're starting out 18, 19, 20, 25, 30, it's much easier to learn Cosen Judo, which is mostly ground techniques. And what was really cool in the book Robert Drysdale was talking about was that the evolution of jiu-jitsu, if you show a Cosen Judo player a lot of techniques, they would have known it.
Dang.
So he was saying that up until like maybe 2010, like the berimbolos, the lapel guards, besides those, they already were doing these things, omoplatas.
Holy smack.
Because the triangle kind of came around like in the 60s, right? So a triangle was new to Brazil. A triangle and omoplata was new to Brazil. Like all these things. And it was going back into like up until the 90s and the 2000s that most of the submissions that we thought in America or Brazil that was new, they were already doing in Japan.
Yeah.
Which is nuts, but it makes sense.
That you kind of do. I mean, a lot of the moves. I mean, if you think hard enough, you could probably recreate the same one. So it's not like you're copying the old moves. You're just recreating a version of the same move that was already created. Yeah,
and it makes sense because he was talking about how, as a human, we're all biologically basically the same. If you hyperextend my elbow, just like how fitness hasn't evolved in terms of like fundamentals. You're squatting, you're hinging at the hips to pick things up, you're pushing things away, you're pulling things to you, you're curling things to you. I mean, it's very
heart rate up, heart rate down. How long?
You're gonna run, you're gonna go swim. Most things are not invented, right? Like in fitness, and that's why it makes sense, martial arts too.